Phyrexia All Will Be One is the newest set on Magic Arena, and with all of its new mechanics and poisonous alternate win conditions, it's shaping up to be a pretty unique format. In this video, I'll be going over everything I learned in the Early Access event to help you get started in this brand new draft format. Without further ado, let's get into it. First off, let's go over all of the mechanics you should know in the format. Toxic is a creature-based mechanic that states players dealt combat damage by this creature also get poison counters equal to this creature's toxic value. If you manage to put 10 or more poison counters on your opponent, they will lose the game. This is pretty hard to do even in a dedicated toxic deck, considering most toxic creatures deal enough regular combat damage to defeat your opponent by life total as well. However, it is definitely doable, especially with some of the other mechanics in the format. While completely poisoning your opponent isn't going to be the most consistent route to victory, toxic creatures are still pretty valuable, as there is another way to use your poison counters that will come up quite often. This leads us to the next mechanic, Corrupted. This is a keyword mechanic marking that your cards with Corrupted will become more powerful as long as your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. When drafting a decent amount of toxic creatures and other spells that add poison counters to your opponent, corrupting your opponent is the much more consistent goal you should have in mind for most games. When things are going well enough, you'll still always have the chance to aim higher, so I like starting off your average toxic decks, shooting for corrupted, and going from there. The primary colors for toxic and corrupted strategies are green, white, and black, as red has no creatures with toxic, and blue only has an uncommon. For the next mechanic, we have oil counters. These counters are generic counters with no inherent ability, similar to charge counters and energy counters from the past. Each card that comes with oil counters will state exactly how the card utilizes them. There are also some cards in the format that care about the number of permanents you control with oil counters on them, or that care about having at least one permanent with oil counters on them. The most consistent colors to supply you with oiled up permanents are green, red, and blue, as neither white or black have any oil counter cards at common. With all of the oil counters and poison counters flying around, we have the returning mechanic Proliferate, which states choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. With this ability, you can add oil counters and loyalty counters to your permanents while adding additional poison counters to your opponent. With toxic and poison being such a big part of white, black, and green's game plan, and oil counters being so prevalent in red, blue, and green, Proliferate becomes a flexible mechanic that can fit into most decks in the format, whichever path they're taking. The final mechanic in the set is for Mirrodin. This is a mechanic on equipment spells in the set that states, when this equipment enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 red rebel creature token, then attach this to it. This is the most narrow mechanic to build around, being primarily in red and white. However, these are just good value spells in general, providing both a creature and an equipment off of one spell. Now that we're familiar with the set's mechanics, let's check out what all of the 2-color pairs in the format are trying to do by going over the format's archetypes. Archetypes are the general deck ideas and synergies that give you a good idea of the kind of decks you'll be playing with and against throughout the format. Blue-white in this format is going to be focused on artifacts. In this archetype, the goal is to go wide with an aggressive strategy, prioritizing playing as many artifacts as possible to buff cards like the Cephalopod Sentry. We have other aggressive abilities on cards like Unctus's Retrofitter, allowing us to animate a non-creature artifact or buff up a smaller artifact creature like Swooping Lookout. In red-white, we have the equipment archetype. In this color pair, the goal is to play a multitude of equipment spells with 4 Mirrodin. This allows us to run a high creature count and a high equipment count at the same time. With this mechanic, we can curve out aggressively with the creatures in the early game, then suit something up with all the equipment that they've left behind in the late game, giving us some staying power even with a very low curve. Premium uncommons for this archetype include Bladehold Warwhip and Hexgold Hoverwings, which not only provide a creature and an equipment, but give a static buff to all of our equipment or all of our equipped creatures. The red-black archetype in this format focuses around getting as many death triggers as possible, wanting to sacrifice our own creatures and artifacts. Our signpost uncommon is Charforger, which provides us with both an expendable goblin token to sacrifice, as well as a payoff for having our cards die. We can also utilize the classic Rakdos sacrifice theme, using Awaken the Sleeper to take control of an opponent's creature and hit them with it, then sacrifice it to our cards like Cutthroat Centurion, effectively fully removing their creature while damaging our opponent and triggering our cards like Charforger. Blue-Black's archetype in the format is based on the Proliferate mechanic. Cards like Voidwing Hybrid can keep coming back from our graveyard whenever we proliferate, while also giving our opponent some poison counters to proliferate with its Toxic ability. Other premium uncommons in the color pair include Drown in Ichor and Serum Snare, showing off that Blue-Black has a good amount of cheap interaction that also proliferates. With that in mind, this is an archetype that should have a decent time playing some more controlling and interactive decks. Blue-Green is an archetype that's going to make use of primarily oil counters and the Proliferate mechanic, but it can proliferate poison counters as well. The signpost uncommon for the archetype is Tainted Observer, which allows you to pay an additional 2 mana as creatures enter the battlefield under your control to proliferate. This makes it so drawing your cheaper creatures like Evolving Adaptive later in the game can still advance your board state by proliferating onto all of your permanents, like Tamiyo's Immobilizer, alongside the adaptive itself. Green-Red is another oil counter focused archetype, this time using the counters to just beat down aggressively. Green-Red has some of the most impressively statted creatures on curve, especially with oil counter synergies. The name of the game here is to curve out with a board state where your creatures will often just naturally outclass your opponents in size. The signpost uncommon for this archetype is Cinder/Ravager, which can be cast for an absurd rate with just a couple early game oil counter creatures at its side. Blue-Red reprises its usual spell slinger role, being focused on casting many non-creature spells. However, in this format, it's going to gain oil counters by doing so. With the oil counter theming added, non-creature spells that allow you to proliferate, like Experimental Augury and Volt Charge, go up highly in value, allowing you to get 2 oil counters on your build-around permanents like Serum Core Chimera and Trawler Drake. Moving on to the Toxic strategies, we have Green-White Toxic. This is a deck that's focused on beating your opponent down with as many toxic creatures as possible. Cards in this archetype reward you for having a high quantity of creatures on the board, especially those with the Toxic mechanic. The core uncommon for the archetype is Slaughter Singer, which will buff up all of your toxic creatures while they attack. Other cards to be on the lookout for are Jawbone Duelist, which benefits greatly from buffs like Slaughter Singers, and Viral Spawning, which can get you 2 decently beefy toxic creatures thanks to its flashback ability, so long as you can corrupt your opponent with your early toxic aggro. For our next toxic archetype, we have Black-White Corrupted. This color pair has some of the highest power payoffs for corrupting your opponent, as well as some of the cheapest ways to get them corrupted in the early game. The color pair has all of the common and uncommon 1-drops with toxic in the format, such as Bilious Skull Dweller, to start getting your opponent corrupted immediately. It also has the strongest corrupted payoffs, like Vivisection Evangelist, which while your opponent is corrupted, allows you to get a 4/4 Vigilance for 5 mana while destroying your opponent's best creature or planeswalker at the same time. For the final archetype, we have Green-Black Toxic, which is the most poisonous of all the archetypes. More than any other archetype, this is the strategy that frequently tries to get its opponent all the way to 10 poison counters. This color pair has some of the highest toxic count creatures, as well as ways to proliferate. Cards like Venomous Brutalizer have both a high toxic value and the ability to proliferate, whereas the gold uncommon Necrogen Rot Priest adds to the poison counters your toxic creatures are dealing, which can lead to some very quick poison victories. Now that you know what archetypes and synergies to be on the lookout for, let's go over some general tips for the format that apply to almost any draft. First off, this is a format where you should take interaction highly. With mechanics like Toxic and Corrupted, it's important to be able to stop your opponent from giving you too many poison counters throughout the game, so having cheap interaction to slow your opponent down will be premium in these matchups. There are also a decent amount of high impact rares and mythics in the format, which you'll want to be able to remove almost immediately when you see them. This is a format with 10 planeswalkers, 5 of which are at rare, and an additional 4 mythics, the returning Praetors from the past couple years, and plenty more powerful rares that are hard to defeat in combat, like Glissa Sunslayer and Miglaw's Maze Crusher. These are cards that need to be dealt with quickly, and removal spells are the easiest way to do so. The second tip I want to mention is a tip that goes for most draft formats, but if you're early in the draft, a great way to start off is sticking to one color and taking powerful colorless cards highly. Some great examples in this format are Prophetic Prism, Mere Convert, and Ichor Plate Golem. Prophetic Prism and Mere Convert are both main deckable mana fixing for almost any archetype, and they leave you more open to splashing in powerful off-color cards that you may open up later in the draft. Mere Convert also doubles as a 2-mana toxic creature, so it's great in toxic decks in white, black, or green, but still a fine card for any deck. The Ichorplate Golem's a little less flexible than the other two, however the oil counter decks do overlap between green, red, and blue, and if your deck is any combination of those colors, the Golem is likely to be a great synergy piece. Taking the Golem is more like taking a hybrid card that you could cast for red or green or blue mana, which is still generally more flexible than taking a monocolored card early, and far more flexible than taking a gold card. Gold cards are great to pick up a little later in the draft, as once multiple players have chosen to pass them, you can start becoming more and more confident that the archetype they put you in is open. With all the archetypes and some general tips out of the way, let's get into the top commons of each color. These are cards to be on the lookout for as solid additions to your deck and can be used as decent signals later during the draft that their colors are open enough to move in on. In white, we have Flensing Raptor, Planar Disruption, and Crawling Chorus. Flensing Raptor is a cheap flyer with Toxic that can send another toxic creature you control into the sky when it hits the board. This helps you chip in for some guaranteed poison counters, getting closer to Corrupted on your opponent, while also providing a solid amount of evasive damage. This is going to be the premium 3-drop for any white-based toxic deck. Planar Disruption is white's best removal spell at common. It has all of the flaws that aura-based removal spells have, where your opponent can bounce their creature back to their hand, or destroy your aura, or sacrifice their creature for value, but at just 2 mana, Planar Disruption is a more than efficient enough rate to make those downsides worth it, especially in a color that is probably going to be the most aggressive color in the format. Crawling Chorus is one of the cheapest toxic creatures in the format, a 1-mana 1/1 with Toxic that can even replace itself with a toxic 1/1 that can't block when it dies. These kinds of cheap creatures with Toxic are perfect for locking in 1 or 2 points of poison in the early game to open up your corrupted spells later on. In blue, we have Experimental Augury, Surgical Skullbomb, and Malcator's Watcher. Experimental Augury is a cheap cantrip, allowing you to put a card from the top 3 cards of your library into your hand, digging you a little bit towards what you need, but it also proliferates when you cast it. With almost every deck in the format caring about either poison or oil counters, Proliferate has played very well, and in the blue-red deck, where many of your creatures get an oil counter just for casting spells, this is a premium card, as it'll put 2 oil counters onto any of those, 1 for casting a spell, and 1 for proliferating. Surgical Skullbomb is a great piece of tempo interaction, allowing you to bounce any creature at sorcery speed for 3 mana. More often than not, this will be used later in the game for a solid tempo swing after your opponent plays a 4 or 5 mana creature, which is already a great card, but it can also kill tokens while drawing you that card, like 1/1 Mites or 1/1 Goblins, and you can even bounce a creature of your own if your opponent puts an aura-based removal spell on it, like Planar Disruption. So a card that's already a solid tempo play that happens to get a bunch of extra little versatility there. Malcator's Watcher is a cheap flyer that you can keep pinging your opponent with, and it gives you back a card when it dies, essentially replacing itself in terms of cards drawn. This is fine filler in any game, but it becomes a pretty incredible swing and card advantage in games where your opponent is aggressive enough to be playing 1 toughness creatures. In matchups like that, you get to fully trade this into one of your opponent's creatures, making it a 2-for-1 thanks to the card draw. In black, we have Anoint with Affliction, Annihilating Glare, and Testament Bearer. Anoint with Affliction fits the bill when it comes to incredible efficient removal. For only 2 mana, you can exile a creature with mana value 3 or less at instant speed, which would already be a high value removal spell, but if you can corrupt your opponent, this is 2 mana to exile any creature, which is completely absurd. Annihilating Glare is another potentially cheap removal spell, but it requires a little more work. With Annihilating Glare, you can remove any creature or planeswalker for only 1 mana, but you have to sacrifice an artifact or creature to do so. There are a few great ways to do this, with cards we've discussed like Crawling Chorus providing expendable mites, Charforger providing a goblin, Prophetic Prism or any cheap form Mirrodin equipment being solid artifacts to sacrifice, but the great thing about this card is that even if you have nothing worth sacrificing, you can still cast this spell later in the game for 5 mana. Testament Bearer is another solid 2-for-1 creature where you get a 4/1 body for 4 mana that replaces itself by allowing you to put a card from the top 3 cards of your library into your hand when it dies. This card attacks very poorly with that 1 toughness, but I expect it to play quite well on the defensive, where you can just hold it up as a high power blocker and cash it in for that 2-for-1 value later. In red we have Volt Charge, Hex Gold Slash, and Furnace Strider. Volt Charge is an exceptional cheap removal spell, as not only can it deal 3 damage to any target, being able to straight up kill or finish off many creatures in the format, but it also proliferates. As stated before, slapping Proliferate onto already decent spells is where you want to be. It gives them the push that takes them from decent additions to your deck to likely some of the best commons in the format. Hex Gold Slash is another cheap removal spell that can deal 2 to any creature or 4 to any creature with Toxic. This can take out almost any creature with Toxic in the set, including many of the beefier green ones, but even if it's just 2 damage, as an instant speed removal spell, it's a solid deal for just 1 mana. Finally, Furnace Strider is just enormous for its mana cost. This is essentially a 5 mana 4/5 haste that can also give your next creature haste with its activated ability. This is a brutal card to have at the top of your curve, as it leads into plays where you get a tremendous amount of unexpected hasting damage sent right to your opponent's face. In green we have Contagious Vorak, Lattice Blade Mantis, and Oil Gorger Troll. Contagious Vorak is the most flexible of these commons, being an incredible addition into every single green deck. This is a 3 mana 3/3 that digs for a land in the top 4 cards of your library. If you find a land, you can choose to put it in your hand, a solid 2-for-1 play, and if you don't find a land or don't want a land, this card still gives you value by proliferating. Lattice Blade Mantis is just enormous for its mana cost. It's a 4 mana 4/3, however, it comes with 2 oil counters that you can use whenever it attacks to untap it and give it +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a creature that essentially attacks as a 4 mana 5/4 Vigilance, which is just massive at common. Even without proliferating, it's a solid card, but with a little bit of oil counter synergies or proliferate in the deck, this card becomes a very high pick. Oil Gorger Troll is a 5 mana 3/4 that gains you 3 life when it enters the battlefield, and if you control a permanent with an oil counter on it, it also draws a card. This is the least flexible of green's top commons, as it's only really worth it if you have a permanent with an oil counter on the board. That being said, green has many of the best oil counter commons like the Lattice Blade Mantis, and if your second color is one of the other oil colors, red or blue, then this is very consistent to trigger. Well, that is going to end my Phyrexia All Will Be One draft guide. If you're interested in seeing some draft walkthroughs of the set, I have a few early access draft videos already on the channel. I also upload daily Magic Arena videos, with a majority of them being draft playthroughs, so there will be plenty more coming as the format progresses these next several days and weeks. If you have your own tips, tricks, and thoughts on the format, feel free to leave them in the comments section below, and if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to help the channel out, you can like and subscribe. I'd also like to thank my lovely patrons for supporting the channel. You can check out the link in the description below if you're interested in joining them, and as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for some more Magic Arena.